Chapter 12 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 12. Losing Sight of the Welsh Mountains. Miss Benson continued in an undecided state of mind for the 2 next days, but on the third, as they sat at breakfast, she began to speak to her brother. "That young creature's name is Ruth Hilton." "Indeed, how did you find it out?" "From herself, of course. She is much stronger. I slept with her last night, and I was aware she was awake long before I liked to speak. But at last I began. I don't know what I said, or how it went on, but I think it was a little relief to her to tell me something about herself. She sobbed and cried to herself. I think she is asleep now." "Tell me what she said about herself." "Oh, it was really very little. It was evidently a most painful subject. She is an orphan, without brother or sister, and with a guardian, whom, I think, she said, she never saw but once. He apprenticed her, after her father's death, to a dressmaker. This Mr. Bellingham got acquainted with her, and they used to meet on Sunday afternoons. One day they were late, lingering on the road, when the dressmaker came up by accident. She seems to have been very angry, and not unnaturally so. The girl took fright at her threats, and the lover persuaded her to go off with him to London, there and then. Last May, I think it was. That's all." "Did she express any sorrow for her error?" "No, not in words, but her voice was broken with sobs, though she tried to make it steady. After a while she began to talk about her baby, but shyly, and with much hesitation. She asked me how much I thought she could earn as a dressmaker, by working very, very hard, and that brought us round to her child. I thought of what you had said, Thurston, and I tried to speak to her as you wished me. I am not sure if it was right. I am doubtful in my own mind still." "Don't be doubtful, Faith, dear Faith. I thank you for your kindness." "There is really nothing to thank me for. It is almost impossible to help being kind to her. There is something so meek and gentle about her, so patient and so grateful." "What does she think of doing?" "Poor child, she thinks of taking lodgings, very cheap ones, she says. There she means to work night and day, to earn enough for her child. For she said to me, with such pretty earnestness, 'It must never know want. Whatever I do, I have deserved suffering, but it will be such a little innocent darling.' Her utmost earnings would not be more than 7 or 8 shillings a week, I'm afraid. And then she is so young and so pretty. There is that £50 Mrs. Morgan brought me, and those 2 letters. Does she know about them yet?" "No, I did not like to tell her till she is a little stronger. Oh, Thurston, I wish there was not this prospect of a child. I cannot help it, I do. I could see a way in which we might help her, if it were not for that." "How do you mean?" "Oh, it's no use thinking of it as it is, or else we might have taken her home with us, and kept her till she had got a little dressmaking in the congregation. But for this meddlesome child, that spoils everything. You must let me grumble to you, Thurston. I was very good to her, and spoke as tenderly and respectfully of the little thing as if it were the Queen's, and born in lawful matrimony." "That's right, my dear Faith. Grumble away to me, if you like. I'll forgive you, for the kind thought of taking her home with us. But do you think her situation is an insuperable objection?" "Why, Thurston, it's so insuperable. It puts it quite out of the question." "How? That's only repeating your objection. Why is it out of the question?" "If there had been no child coming, we might have called her by her right name, Miss Hilton. That's one thing. Then Another is, the baby in our house. Why, Sally would go distraught." "Never mind Sally. If she were an orphan relation of our own, left widowed," said he, pausing as if in doubt, "you yourself suggested she should be considered as a widow, for the child's sake. I am only taking up your ideas, dear Faith. I respect you for thinking of taking her home. It is just what we ought to do. Thank you for reminding me of my duty." "Nay, it was only a passing thought. Think of Mr. Bradshaw. Oh, I tremble at the thought of his grim displeasure." "We must think of a higher than Mr. Bradshaw. I own I should be a very coward if he knew. He is so severe, so inflexible. But after all, he sees so little of us. He never comes to tea, you know, but is always engaged when Mrs. Bradshaw comes. I don't think he knows of what our household consists." "Not know, Sally? Oh, yes, but he does. He asked Mrs. Bradshaw one day if she knew what wages we gave her, and said we might get a far more efficient and younger servant for the money. And, speaking about money, think what our expenses would be if we took her home for the next 6 months." That consideration was a puzzling one, and both sat silent and perplexed for a time. Miss Benson was as sorrowful as her brother, for she was becoming as anxious as he was to find it possible that her plan could be carried out. "There's the £50," said he, with a sigh of reluctance at the idea. "Yes, there's the £50," echoed his sister, with the same sadness in her tone. "I suppose it is hers." "I suppose it is, and being so, we must not think who gave it to her. It will defray her expenses. I am very sorry, but I think we must take it." "It would never do to apply to him under the present circumstances," said Miss Benson, in a hesitating manner. "No, that we won't," said her brother decisively. "If she consents to let us take care of her, we will never let her stoop to request anything from him, even for his child. She can live on bread and water. We can all live on bread and water, rather than that." "Then I will speak to her and propose the plan. Oh, Thurston, from a child you could persuade me to anything. I hope I am doing right. However much I oppose you at first, I am sure to yield soon, almost in proportion to my violence at first. I think I am very weak." "No, not in this instance. We are both right. I, in the way in which the child ought to be viewed. You, dear good Faith, for thinking of taking her home with us. God bless you, dear, for it." When Ruth began to sit up, and the strange, new, delicious prospect of becoming a mother seemed to give her some mysterious source of strength, so that her recovery was rapid and swift from that time, Miss Benson brought her the letters and the bank-note. "Do you recollect receiving this letter, Ruth?" asked she, with grave gentleness. Ruth changed colour, and took it and read it again, without making any reply to Miss Benson. Then she sighed and thought a while, and then took up and read the second note, the note which Mrs. Bellingham had sent to Mr. Benson in answer to his. After that she took up the bank-note and turned it round and round, but not as if she saw it. Miss Benson noticed that her fingers trembled sadly, and that her lips were quivering for some time before she spoke. "If you please, Miss Benson, I should like to return this money." "Why, my dear?" "I have a strong feeling against taking it." "While he," said she, deeply blushing, and letting her large white lids drop down and veil her eyes, "loved me, he gave me many things, my watch, oh, many things, and I took them from him gladly and thankfully, because he loved me, for I would have given him anything, and I thought of them as signs of love. But this money pains my heart. He has left off loving me, and has gone away. This money seems, oh, Miss Benson, it seems as if he could comfort me for being forsaken by money. And at that word the tears, so long kept back and repressed, forced their way like rain. She checked herself, however, in the violence of her emotion, for she thought of her child. "So, will you take the trouble of sending it back to Mrs. Bellingham?" "That I will, my dear. I am glad of it, that I am. They don't deserve to have the power of giving. They don't deserve that you should take it." Miss Benson went and enclosed it up there and then, simply writing these words in the envelope: "From Ruth Hilton." "And now we wash our hands of these Bellinghams," said she triumphantly. But Ruth looked tearful and sad, not about returning the note, but from the conviction that the reason she had given for the ground of her determination was true. He no longer loved her. To cheer her, Miss Benson began to speak of the future. Miss Benson was one of those people who, the more she spoke of a plan in its details, and the more she realized it in her own mind, the more firmly she became a partisan of the project. Thus she grew warm and happy in the idea of taking Ruth home. But Ruth remained depressed and languid under the conviction that he no longer loved her. No home, no future, but the thought of her child could wean her from this sorrow. Miss Benson was a little piqued, and this pique showed itself afterwards in talking to her brother of the morning's proceedings in the sick chamber. "I admired her at the time for sending away her £50 so proudly, but I think she has a cold heart. She hardly thanked me at all for my proposal of taking her home with us. Her thoughts are full of other things just now, and people have such different ways of showing feeling, some by silence, some by words. At any rate, it is unwise to expect gratitude." "What do you expect? Not indifference or ingratitude." "It is better not to expect or calculate consequences. The longer I live, the more fully I see that. Let us try simply to do right actions, without thinking of the feelings they are to call out in others. We know that no holy or self-denying effort can fall to the ground vain and useless. But the sweep of eternity is large, and God alone knows when the effect is to be produced. We are trying to do right now, and to feel right. Don't let us perplex ourselves with endeavouring to map out how she should feel, or how she should show her feelings." "That's all very fine, and I dare say very true," said Miss Benson, a little chagrined. "But a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I would rather have one good hearty thank you now for all I have been planning to do for her, than the grand effects you promise me in the sweep of eternity. Don't be grave and sorrowful, Thurston, or I shall go out of the room. I can stand Sally's scoldings, but I can't bear your look of quiet depression whenever I am a little hasty or impatient. I had rather you would give me a good box on the ear. And I would often rather you would speak, if ever so hastily, instead of whistling. So, if I box your ears when I am vexed with you, will you promise to scold me when you are put out of the way, instead of whistling?" "Very well, that's a bargain. You box, and I scold. But seriously, I began to calculate our money when she so cavalierly sent off the £50 note. I can't help admiring her for it. And I am very much afraid we shall not have enough to pay the doctor's bill and take her home with us." "She must go inside the coach, whatever we do," said Mr. Benson decidedly. "Who's there? Come in. Oh, Mrs. Hughes, sit down." "Indeed, sir, and I cannot stay. But the young lady has just made me find up her watch for her, and asked me to get it sold to pay the doctor, and the little things she has had since she came. And please, sir, indeed, I don't know where to sell it nearer than Carnarvon." "That is good of her," said Miss Benson, her sense of justice satisfied, and remembering the way in which Ruth had spoken of the watch, she felt what a sacrifice it must have been to resolve to part with it. "And her goodness just helps us out of our dilemma," said her brother, who was unaware of the feelings with which Ruth regarded her watch, or perhaps he might have parted with his Facciolati. Mrs. Hughes patiently awaited their leisure for answering her practical question. Where could the watch be sold? Suddenly her face brightened. "Mr. Jones, the doctor, is just going to be married. Perhaps he would like nothing better than to give this pretty watch to his bride. Indeed, I think it very likely, and he'll pay money for it, as well as letting alone his bill. I'll ask him, sir, at any rate." Mr. Jones was only too glad to obtain possession of so elegant a present at so cheap a rate. He even, as Mrs. Hughes had foretold, paid money for it, more than was required to defray the expenses of Ruth's accommodation, as most of the articles of food she had were paid for at the time by Mr. or Miss Benson, but they strictly forbade Mrs. Hughes to tell Ruth of this. "Would you object to buying you a black gown?" said Miss Benson to her, the day after the sale of the watch. She hesitated a little, and then went on. "My brother and I think it would be better to call you, as if in fact you were, a widow. It will save much awkwardness, and it will spare your child much mortification." She was going to have added, but that word did not exactly do. But at the mention of her child, Ruth started and turned ruby red, as she always did when the allusion was made to it. "Oh, yes, certainly. Thank you much for thinking of it, indeed," said she, very low, as if to herself. "I don't know how to thank you for all you are doing, but I do love you, and I will pray for you if I may." "If you may, Ruth," repeated Miss Benson, in a tone of surprise. "Yes, if I may, if you will let me pray for you." "Certainly, my dear. My dear Ruth, you don't know how often I sin. I do so wrong, with my few temptations. We are both of us great sinners in the eyes of the Most Holy. Let us pray for each other. Don't speak so again, my dear, at least not to me." Miss Benson was actually crying. She had always looked upon herself as so inferior to her brother in real goodness, had seen such heights above her, that she was distressed by Ruth's humility. After a short time she resumed the subject. "Then I may get you a black gown, and we may call you Mrs. Hilton?" "No, not Mrs. Hilton," said Ruth hastily. Miss Benson, who had hitherto kept her eyes averted from Ruth's face from a motive of kindly delicacy, now looked at her with surprise. "Why not?" asked she. "It was my mother's name," said Ruth, in a low voice. "I had better not be called by it." "Then let us call you by my mother's name," said Miss Benson tenderly. She would have. "But I'll talk to you about my mother some other time. Let me call you Mrs. Denbigh. It will do very well. People will think you are a distant relation." When she told Mr. Benson of this choice of name, he was rather sorry. It was like his sister's impulsive kindness, impulsive in everything, and he could imagine how Ruth's humility had touched her. He was sorry, but he said nothing, and now the letter was written home, announcing the probable arrival of the brother and sister on a certain day, with a distant relation, early left a widow, as Miss Benson expressed it. She desired the spare room might be prepared, and made every provision she could think of for Ruth's comfort, for Ruth still remained feeble and weak. When the black gown, at which she had stitched away incessantly, was finished, when nothing remained but to rest for the next day's journey, Ruth could not sit still. She wandered from window to window, learning off each rock and tree by heart. Each had its tale, which it was agony to remember, but which it would have been worse agony to forget. The sound of running waters she had heard that quiet evening was in her ears as she lay on her deathbed. So well had she learnt their tune. And now all was over. She had driven in to Llandew, sitting by her lover's side, living in the bright present, and strangely forgetful of the past or the future. She had dreamed out her dream, and she had awakened from the vision of love. She walked slowly and sadly down the long hill, her tears fast falling, but as quickly wiped away, while she strove to make steady the low, quivering voice which was often called upon to answer some remark of Miss Benson's. They had to wait for the coach. Ruth buried her face in some flowers which Mrs. Hughes had given her on parting, and was startled when the mail drew up with a sudden pull, which almost threw the horses on their haunches. She was placed inside, and the coach had set off again, before she was fully aware that Mr. and Miss Benson were travelling on the outside. But it was a relief to feel she might now cry without exciting their notice. The shadow of a heavy thundercloud was on the valley, but the little upland village church, that showed the spot in which so much of her life was passed, stood out clear in the sunshine. She grudged the tears that blinded her as she gazed. There was one passenger who tried after a while to comfort her. "Don't cry, miss," said the kind-hearted woman. "You're parting from friends, maybe. Well, that's bad enough, but when you come to my age, you'll think none of it. Why, I've 3 sons, and they're soldiers and sailors, all of them, here, there, and everywhere. One is in America, beyond the seas. Another is in China, making tea, and another is at Gibraltar, 3 miles from Spain. And yet, you see, I can laugh and eat and enjoy myself. I sometimes think I'll try and fret a bit, just to make myself a better figure. But, Lord, it's no use. It's against my nature, so I laugh and grow fat again. I'd be quite thankful for a fit of anxiety as would make me feel easy in my clothes, which them manty-makers will make so tight I'm fairly throttled." Ruth durst cry no more. It was no relief. Now she was watched and noticed, and plied with a sandwich or a gingerbread each time she looked sad. She lay back with her eyes shut, as if asleep, and went on and on, the sun never seeming to move from his high place in the sky, nor the bright hot day to show the least sign of waning. Every now and then Miss Benson scrambled down and made kind inquiries of the pale, weary Ruth, and once they changed coaches, and the fat old lady left her with a hearty shake of the hand. "It is not much farther now," said Miss Benson apologetically to Ruth. "See, we are losing sight of the Welsh mountains. We have about 18 miles of plain, and then we come to the moors and the rising ground, amidst which Eccleston lies. I wish we were there, for my brother is sadly tired." The first wonder in Ruth's mind was, why then, if Mr. Benson was so tired, did they not stop where they were for the night? For she knew little of the expenses of a night at an inn. The next thought was, to beg that Mr. Benson would take her place inside the coach, and allow her to mount up by Miss Benson. She proposed this, and Miss Benson was evidently pleased. "Well, if you're not tired, it would be a rest and a change for him, to be sure, and if you were by me, I could show you the first sight of Eccleston, if we reach there before it is quite dark." So Mr. Benson got down and changed places with Ruth. She hardly yet understood the numerous small economies which he and his sister had to practise, the little daily self-denials, all endured so cheerfully and simply that they had almost ceased to require an effort, and it had become natural to them to think of others before themselves. Ruth had not understood that it was for economy that their places had been taken on the outside of the coach, while hers, as an invalid requiring rest, was to be the inside, and that the biscuits which supplied the place of a dinner were in fact chosen, because the difference in price between the two would go a little way towards fulfilling their plan for receiving her as an inmate. Her thought about money had been hitherto a child's thought. The subject had never touched her, but afterwards, when she lived a little while with the Bensons, her eyes were opened, and she remembered their simple kindness on the journey, and treasured the remembrance of it in her heart. A low grey cloud was the first sign of Eccleston. It was the smoke of the town hanging over the plain. Beyond the place where she was expected to believe it existed arose round, waving uplands, nothing to the fine outlines of the Welsh mountains, but still going up nearer to heaven than the rest of the flat world into which she had now entered. Rumbling stones, lamp-posts, a sudden stop, and they were in the town of Eccleston, and a strange, uncouth voice on the dark side of the coach was heard to say, "Be ye there, master?" "Yes, yes," said Miss Benson quickly. "Did Sally send you, Ben? Get the ostler's lantern, and look out the luggage." End of chapter 12.